Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the session, The Talent Fee, How Social Media Content May Influence NIL Valuation of Student Athletes. If you have any questions for the presenters, please type them in the chat box and we will address them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. And now it's an honor to introduce the presenters, Dr. Heather Van Mullum and Dr. Kirby Bain.
Cool. Thank you. Pleasure to be talking with everybody today. We're going to be talking about this idea of the talent fee. It really deals into this new emerging trend of NIL and this kind of emerging market. So we're happy to be with all of you today and kind of just talking about NIL as a whole and some of the top student athletes in today's age. This idea of creating personal brands and being able to now monetize those brands, and social media plays a major role in that. It's influencing how these student athletes are choosing where to go to school, how these schools are choosing then to use their funds to make sure that they're putting the best teams out on the field. You look at some of the top valuations. You have Shedeur Sanders at $5.8 million from Colorado, Livy Dunn at $4 million at LSU. You have Dylan Stewart, the true freshman defensive end from South Carolina, is renegotiating for his new valuation of $1.5 million. So it's really turning the college sports world upside down in terms of new legislation, allowing the monetization of these brands. Schools are also having to adjust of where do they create revenue to potentially provide access to those funds for the players. Tennessee's adding a talent fee to their season tickets next year of 10% on top of already increasing ticket prices by 4.5%. And then Arkansas also added a 3% increase to their concessions at their revenue sporting stadiums this season to try and generate more money so those players have the opportunity to generate revenue. And social media, building that brand, plays a big role. Social media and this idea of two-way communication between student athletes and fans of a given college and institution to be able to interact about life experiences are really big. And it's going to be an idea that we're going to look at. We've looked at some of the top NIL evaluated athletes and are excited to share our findings with you today.
So before we dive into some of those findings and chat with you about the study design itself, we thought it was important to discuss some of the literature and some of the trends we see in the literature regarding media coverage and gender. So as you probably know, female athletes in general, compared to male athletes, tend to receive less coverage. And the type of coverage they receive tends to differ considerably. It tends to focus more on their physical appearance rather than on their competence or their success as an athlete. And coverage matters. And we know this from just thinking about the media in general. Why it might not tell us what to think, it certainly can influence how we think. And I love this quote from Kellner that you see below. Quote, media stories and images provide the symbols, myths, and resources which help constitute a common culture for the majority of individuals, end quote. And I mean, the power of word choice, the power of image choice, the power of timing, all of these stories and the images and the text that gets wrapped up into them, and then sort of they take on a life of their own in some cases, they can establish a sense of culture or identity or expectation for how things should function. And certainly what we see in the media is not different from other stories that are generated on other topics besides sport. So there's long been quite a bit of research that's been done, not so much, at least initially, on how athletes were generating and building their own brand, but rather looking at how mainstream media companies were marketing athletes themselves. And so historically, as I mentioned, right, we've seen some really distinct differences, not just in quantity, but also quality of coverage. And so now that we're in this new space, this growing space where athletes have the opportunities to build their own brands, of question, right, is what decisions are they making that are influencing how they choose to market themselves? And their sense of who they are as an athlete and how they identify as an athlete. What does that mean in terms of the broader conversations of brand choice, of marketing choice, of image choice, of text choice, all of those things? And I love this quote from Mary Jo Kane. I'm sure you're familiar with her work. She recently retired from the Tucker Center at the University of Minnesota. And she famously said, quote, "Sex sells sex, not women's sport," end quote. And I mean, this has been the ongoing conversation for people who study gender, media, and sport, this broader conversation of how is it that athletes are being marketed, and in particular, female athletes, if they are marketed in such a way that sells them as women or as hyper heterosexualized females rather than as competent athletes. What are the long-term implications for that messaging, given that we know those symbols carry quite a bit of meaning?
And then moving into just this idea of the sport ethic, and in terms of this idea of the athlete identity and trying to conform to some of those norms that you see listed on the PowerPoint above, I think we can all potentially think of some examples of how media coverage portrays athletes, that idea of sacrificing everything for maybe performance, but the underlying meaning of the game or sport that they're choosing to play, distinguishing yourself from others, the common "be like Mike" Gatorade ads, and distinguishing yourself. And with Michael Jordan, that's elevating, winning, being one of the top athletes of a generation, and really providing a distinction between him and the other players in the NBA would be an example. And that idea of taking risk and not letting anything getting in the way of your success, and then facing challenges. A lot of student athletes are going to face challenges, and it's being able to push past those challenges in the given moment. So that's the norms that we were looking at in terms of the idea of how student athletes and athletes as a whole choose to portray themselves, or the media chooses to portray them. So when we're examining certain tweets made by professional athletes, it was found that male athletes were actually more likely to affirm the sport ethic. In terms of those categories where you're looking to strive and distinguish yourself, playing through the pain, on things of that nature. So that was the literature that informed kind of our coding sequences and the process of this study.
So to share with you the methodology. So we looked at the on3.com website. That's a commonly accessed website for looking at evaluation of intercollegiate student athletes. And we chose the top 10 male and the top 10 female student athletes that were ranked highest in valuation. And so then over a 4-hour period on one day, we took screenshots of their last 100 Instagram posts that were on their individual accounts. And then from those posts, and again, we were just looking at the images. We weren't reading comments or looking at videos, but rather still photos. Those images were coded for athlete competence and for perpetuation of the sport ethic. And as Kirby just mentioned, right, we were looking at those 4 norms that Hughes and Coakley first came up with when they were describing what is the sport ethic, and what are those pieces that are composed of it. And you can see that on the right side of that table below. So playing through pain, striving for distinction, accepting no obstacles and taking risks, and then ultimately, right, being dedicated to or challenging any limits that might get in their way. In comparison, the 3 coding pieces for athlete competence were taken from the Kane and Buse 2005 study, in which, and this study has been, this methodology has been used in several studies since, but coding to see whether or not in that presentation of self, the athlete was, or the individual was in or out of uniform, if they were on or off their court or field of play, and if they were in an active or a passive pose. And this work that's been done in this area of athlete competence, it says that if it depends on how people are portrayed. Are we more likely to see them as an athlete? And are we more likely to see them as an athlete who is competent in their craft, who is going to be successful, we would easily identify as an athlete based upon the image that we're presented with. And so this particular methodology uses these three coding aspects to determine whether or not competence would be established from the image itself. So as I mentioned before, we only coded images. We did not code the videos or the text that was associated with those Instagram posts. And as I mentioned before, our goal was to take the last 100 posts and examine those from each of the 10 athletes. And so as you look at the number of posts reviewed, you're probably like, well, hang on a second, that's not even close to what you said you were going to do. And again, this goes back to the reality of what was accessible. So in some cases, some of the athletes did not have 100 posts. In other cases, perhaps they had 100 or more posts, but they had tons of videos, or maybe they just they were sharing something from some other individual or from some other site. And so all said and done, when we were able to look just specifically at the images themselves, we had at our disposal 302 posts to code for male athletes and 656 posts to code for female athletes. And we chose Instagram because, I mean, there's all kinds of social media platforms that you could perhaps use. So the study previously that Kirby spoke about, my student and I looked at Twitter, now X, and looked at the tweets that people were making. But in this case, because we were also looking for competence, and then we thought the imagery would be really important. And we also know that Instagram is just really a popular platform that people are using.
And for anybody tuning in, Heather and I have had some discussion just about the number of post differences between the male athletes and the female athletes. We'd be really interested come the end of this presentation if anybody had some thoughts of why that may be, or why it kind of lended it that way, that the female athletes doubled up the male athletes in terms of the number of posts that we were able to review and code.
In this next slide here, we're going to show you our results. And I think as a part of those results, we can start to maybe dive into perhaps why we see such a significant difference, a substantial difference, I should say, between the number of posts between male and female athletes.
Yeah, so you can see here, we have our number of posts above, but you can see kind of the percentage breakdown of the athletic competence and the sport ethic as well, in terms of how these athletes are choosing to present themselves via social media on those outlets. And I think it's really interesting to take into account in terms of kind of understanding male athletes, female athletes, but that calling back to the literature review, how this may influence kind of those psychological aspects of the female athletes in terms of how may they see their quote unquote best way to monetize their brand through social media. And looking at some of the numbers, we can see some of the differences in terms of how the two genders choose to brand themselves via these social media channels.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at the numbers, right, you can see some really interesting trends. And I think, as Kirby shared, this really supports the previous literature that's been published on this topic. So if we're looking at athlete competence in particular, you can see that consistently across all three, male athletes were more likely, even though they had far less posts, to portray themselves in ways that established greater competence as an athlete compared to female athletes. And that's consistent with previous research. And, as Kirby was sharing, right, that psychological piece or the component, but also, as we were talking about earlier, the culture that is created in terms of mediated representation of athletes, and consistently, right, this similar messaging that we see across. But then in comparison, you can look down below at the statistics and the data for sport ethics. And again, we're just comparing percentage points, right? But here, interestingly enough, here we see that consistently, female athletes were more likely than male athletes to post in such a way that adhered to the sport ethic and the norms of the sport ethic, if you will. And again, that's not a lot. Again, we were just looking at images. I think had we analyzed text or comments, perhaps we would see some differences in terms of representation of the norms of the sport ethic. It was a little bit more challenging, I think, to distinguish those things or to determine those things from images themselves. But that's something we can chat about as well, as we're talking about sort of, what do we take away from what it is that we've learned from this particular project.
And in terms of looking forward, in terms of what these implications are to the field moving forward, it's seeing that the results were similar and consistent with previous studies in terms of how male athletes are portraying themselves as focusing in on those competent norms that we discussed earlier, and then kind of understanding how the post influenced that NIL valuation as well, in terms of what type of content's being posted, in terms of that long-term brand potential as well. With NIL, student athletes are choosing to stay in college. They're potentially passing up professional aspirations because they're able to build their brand. And I think we may have seen this with the NCAA women's tournament and the success compared to the men. They had players that were on those teams for multiple years. They were able to build connections with the fan bases and build their own brands. And now we're seeing that once they're in the professional level as well. And we'd really love to hear some of your thoughts on some of those current events going on right now, to see how those brands have been built and your thoughts on how those female athletes are portrayed and the results of our study as well.
Yeah, we think that maybe, given the value that's associated with the sport ethic itself and those norms, because they're so intensely embedded into sport culture today, that the reason why female athletes might have chosen to portray themselves or support those norms in their posts was that it helps to establish a sense of relevance within this space that is so competitive, and not just competitive in terms of win-loss, right? But also in terms of the potential to generate revenue through NIL. Um, I did think it was interesting, and I was maybe I shouldn't have been surprised. I tend to be a little bit more hopeful, maybe than perhaps I should be. I should be a bit more of a realist, but um, I was a little surprised that there was such a difference between the identified gender of the athlete compared to images that might portray competence, given that there's been so many ongoing discussions about the power of building a brand and the implications of that within women's sport. I did anticipate perhaps that we might see more female athletes choosing to portray themselves or post images of themselves that portray them in more competent, athletic competent ways based upon the framework that we discussed earlier. But I mean, these pressures are still so inherent to how we function and how we coexist with one another. And so perhaps that pressure to adhere to those traditional gender norms is just strong. I mean, there was this really interesting study, and perhaps you're aware of it, it came out of the Tucker Center several years ago, where they asked female athletes what their preference would be in terms of how they were represented. And athletes overwhelmingly chose the image that would portray them as a competent athlete. But they also, as a part of that conversation, were able to articulate that they understood that perhaps the image that might generate more connectivity with fans and interactivity in those social media spaces was one that also highlighted some of those traditional gender norms. And so I don't know. I think I was sort of thinking that perhaps when athletes have the choice, that they would choose to portray themselves as a more competent athlete because that's how they see themselves. But in this world and in this space where those norms are still heavily influencing market value and market potential, perhaps that maybe isn't as strong as I had originally thought. And we can think about this just even in terms of like recent things that have happened. So I'm sure you're aware of the Shaquille O'Neal has been serving as a mentor, if you will, to Angel Reese, a women's professional basketball player. And, um, you know, I thought that she sort of saw him as a father figure. And then I was shocked when I saw that he had made some heavily sexualized comments about her and her clothing and her attire and what she was wearing, and how that might impact her ability to increase her marketability. And so I don't know, there's these sort of weird interactions that continue to happen and occur that that give pause, that I think are influencing or are likely to influence these choices that athletes are making in terms of what they choose to post or how they choose to engage with their various medias. So that, in summary, is a quick overview of of our project and of what we learned. And we're happy to share with you today our preliminary findings, looking at the comparison between these two areas. I think, as we think to the future, it would make sense to look at the interactivity with fans and athletes on these posts. We would probably have a better understanding of how fans are viewing this based upon comments, perhaps number of likes, number of times these images are being shared. And so in terms of like next steps, I think those things make sense as we try to better understand fan engagement and interaction with these different strategies that athletes are using.
Yeah, so we'd like to open it up for questions or just a general discussion. We think there's a lot we can pull from, and we'd really love to hear from the audience about the topic at hand. Were there any comments in the chat at all? We could start there.
I'm looking right now. So far, I don't believe so.
Okay.
Yeah, no comments yet.
Yeah, anything else you'd like to share?
I don't have anything.
Yeah.
Is it okay if I know I'm the moderator, can I ask a question?
Yes,
Yeah,
please.
please.
Okay. So with the way NIL has evolved over the past several years anyway, and the recent court cases, how do you see court cases such as educational expenses now are allowed for student athletes to be received upon? Just sort of if you were to look in your crystal ball, where do you see the evolution of NIL going in the next, let's say, 10 years?
I think it'll be really interesting to see how some of the legislations passed, and then even how how universities choose to spend their money as well. If has to be shared equally, how Title IX then gets involved, but also some donor fatigue potentially in terms of passing on the cost onto the donors to run some of these athletic departments. Obviously, there's a lot of money coming in through TV contracts now that institutions are able to generate revenue through the media rights deals. But I'd be really interested to see if certain universities that say have 29 varsity sports they're sponsoring, how do they allocate those certain funds? Will it be equitable between gender? How will certain schools be able to perform consistently? I think it influences a variety of things that would impact coaching success. You have your development and donations as well, and then also just student athletes with the transfer portal now. That's a whole nother thing we didn't even touch on that if their brand recognition is able to be seen better at another institution, they could be jumping ship, and all that money being invested through NIL valuation and the like, or the universities don't reap the benefits of it as well. So it's a really interesting time.
I'm also really curious. I mean, we're at a small school. We work at an NAI institution. And I mean, I think initially, right, there was conversations that NIL was really going to be seen as a benefit at smaller institutions. And I don't know that we've realized that. I am curious though to see as this continues to evolve, there will be if there will be the potential for athletes at smaller institutions to sort of leverage their space in smaller communities where institutions are sort of, a big part of the ebb and flow of communities. If we might see more, I mean, obviously not at the grand scale, we see it with major Power Four conferences with NCAA Division I athletes, but I'm really curious to see if this evolves at all into smaller institutions and smaller markets. We see a little bit of it in the community in which we live, but really very little. And so it's always interesting to talk with student athletes at our institution about their perspectives about NIL, because it's just not really a part of what their reality looks like. Although I think they're quite curious about it and do wonder. And now that the portal allows for year-to-year transfer, we have seen some student athletes leave and have the potential to monetize if they go to larger institutions. So I'm really curious about that. I'm really curious to see how this might evolve for smaller institutions.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the
question.
question.
Anyone else, maybe any questions? Okay, well, if there's no further questions, I want to thank everyone for attending the session. And thank you again to our two presenters. And I wish you all, this is the last session of the conference. I want to thank everyone and have a wonderful weekend.
Awesome.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.